Good day. I'm glad to talk to you today about a subject which is unusual for me, which is not to talk about risk management, but why I'm afraid risk management has become a millstone around many organizations' necks in the world. And this presentation is a joint one by myself and my colleague, Roger Estelle. And we're making it as part of Risk Awareness Week in 2019. Our contention is that, and I'm going to explain more detail on this in a moment, is that there is no agreement and there never was any agreement about what the problem is that risk management's supposed to solve. Everywhere you go nowadays, you hear the phrase risk management, but what does it mean? And even of those who advocate its adoptions and practice this noble art, mainly because they earn a living from it, to be frank, there's no agreement on what risk management means or even why we're really doing it. You will hear various claims that it supports decision making, that it's part of governance and so on, but there's very little behind those claims. And as we will show later, particularly when it comes to decision making, in fact, latter day risk management could be impeding quality decision making rather than aiding it. And what we see nowadays is a very clumsy, multiple layered approach with lots of different confections and constructs and a jargon which seems to change almost by the day that actually seems to get in the way of decision making, particularly by normal people. And to be absolutely frank, therefore doesn't help organizational performance despite the many claims and will probably impede it. So that's our contention, and that's what we wanted to speak about today. My colleague Roger asked anybody that's in the profession a very simple question. If risk management is the answer, what was the question? And I'd suggest that you might want to answer that. One tip though, in answering it, you mustn't use the word risk. So what is risk management the answer to? What was the question in the first place? We have our own views about why we've ended up in this position, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. But particularly if you're in the risk management profession, I think you should reflect very carefully on why you're there and what you actually do. Now, the reason we feel that we can do that, that's Roger and myself, is we've contributed to what's a pretty miserable state of affairs, and we've done that over many years. Both he and I have served on probably too many committees that have written standards. And in my case, this is my 44th year of practicing the wicked art of risk management. So a lot of the problems which we face nowadays probably could be attributed in some way to what I've done over the years. And because of this, we think we're probably better prepared than most people to explain, well, how do we get to this position? How this thing called risk management started, how in fact it has become a millstone around the necks of organizations, and really why it isn't successful and it can't be fixed. Simple as that. And therefore, you know, the game is up, guys. We need to move on. We need to leave all these edifices and confections behind and shed this millstone and move back to, quite frankly, where I was 44 years ago, which is helping organizations and decision makers in organizations make better decisions, as simple as that. So let's just go a little bit of history here. Now, we know that decisions can, of course, deliver the outcomes that we wish, but so often we end up with outcomes which are not quite what we intended. And most of these will have trivial consequences, but occasionally quite innocent decisions can lead to dramatically adverse consequences which affect innocent parties or which attract significant public attention. Notable, of course, is things like the collapse of Enron in 2001, the sinking of the Titanic, the Challenger space shuttle disaster, and more recently and very currently, of course, the way that various religious institutions suppressed child sex abuse accusations. In all those cases, decisions were made which didn't lead to the outcomes which the decision makers intended. So really from the beginnings of time, and certainly if you believe Peter Bernstein in his book Against the Odds, since the Reformation, mankind has always been trying to find better ways of making decisions. And those people that were that had the greatest interest in avoiding similar sort of catastrophes, the search was strongest there, and they were the strongest advocates of this practice called risk management. And obviously in the early days, it was government agencies and insurers. They had most at risk, if you like. And in many cases, risk management became as very simple prescriptive solutions. One of the most elegant out there, of course, is the plimsoll line, the line that is painted on the side of cargo ships to prevent them being overloaded. Very simple, very effective, and therefore led directly to good decisions about the amount of load that could be put in a cargo vessel. The term risk management really was invented as a label to describe all those various efforts to avoid humans making bad mistakes and because they made bad decisions. And those with the most to gain use their influence and power to drive the adoption of this thing called risk management. And of course, of those, governments have always been able to prescribe legislation. They have the levers to pull to force people to do things. In my case, I started my career in the UK in the 1970s in health and safety, working for the government enforcement authority there. And until the Robins report of 1972, nearly all the legislation in occupational health and safety in the UK had been prescriptive. You know, you will do this. It will be this long, it will be repeated this often, and so on. And with Robins, we suddenly realized that we couldn't keep up with technology. It was wrong for government regulators to be prescriptive, and we should put the onus back on employers to actually effectively assess the risk and decide what to be done. And we started to write risk management into our legislation there. Similarly with insurers, who have contractual leaders to force those that they insure to do certain things. Outside of government and outside insurers, other advocates who wanted to promote better decision making used this title, this label of risk management, and to convince people that it was a good thing and therefore in many cases they should buy services from them, they elevated this simple label to the status of a belief system. And I'll talk a little bit about what a belief system is in a moment. The need to label it as risk management suited them very, very nicely, and the fact they really didn't have a precise or fixed meaning suited them very well. It became synonymous, and is still in many cases synonymous, with methods to avoid mistakes and impose harm on people and organizations. The word uncertainty wasn't used a great deal in the early days, but implicitly was that we wanted to become more certain of outcomes, and therefore we wanted to have less uncertainty in terms of the outcomes of decisions. Now, I said that risk management became a belief system. And if you look at belief systems generally, they have certain criteria, they have certain characteristics. First of all, they seem to have laudable goals, and yet often there's no very clear definition of what the problem is. But you know, you feel good if you support them. Often, and of course I have in mind religion as well as other forms of belief system, that they are natural. They're not following the normal course of events, and often what they propose conflicts with what normally happens in real life. They're based on assertions and concepts and beliefs which are largely unvalidated, although often there is some post-validation. We think of the concept first and then we seem to backfit the science to it. There's invariably a confected jargon, a philosophy which builds itself up almost as real knowledge. And at the end of the day, the belief system is really defined by its label rather than what it actually does or what it's intended to do. And of course, there are disciples. There are those who are the evangelists, and they're extremely enthusiastic with their belief systems, and they feel almost as though belief itself is all that's needed, and that the belief system is an indispensable and fundamental truth. It has it becomes as indispensable as things like gravity, water, or unfortunately taxes. And although there's no general knowledge base, nevertheless it becomes part of life. And these enthusiastic disciples, and often they're very enthusiastic because, to be frank, they make money or gain status about it, propel the belief system forward and try and convince others to adopt it. Now, that was the mode that I was certainly in the 1970s and the 80s. And when I was working throughout Europe with large organizations trying to get them to adopt risk management, I have to say that invariably I hit a problem. Most directors, most managers were highly skeptical. They didn't believe it. They saw a significant disconnect between the sort of processes that I was talking about and the way their organizations actually worked and what they actually did. They really couldn't see what was in it for them. They couldn't see the benefit of putting all this hard work in. In fact, often they were saying to me, I'm not sure I want to know what you're telling to me, and I certainly don't want other people to know what you're revealing by this risk management activity. Certainly, risk management was regarded almost as snake oil. It was like a pseudoscience that nobody really wanted to believe it. And that was compounded by the fact that it was an exclusive club. Only a small people seemed to understand the jargon and the concepts and be able to master them and to use the language. And 40 years on, 30 years on, that's become even worse. The jargon has become more extensive, the concepts more intricate. There's nowadays even less agreement on what basic terms mean, and risk management is definitely an external agent for an organization and not something which normal people really either can understand or really want to understand. And yet, risk management has survived and, if anything, has thrived. And this seems to us to be due to three main influences. First of all, these disciples of the belief system became advisors to organizations, both external and internal. They were associated particularly with in the insurance business and with the auditing profession, and therefore they had some supplementary levers they could pull to ensure that organizations started to use the language and tentatively started to think about risk management as something essential. Then these disciples met together and somewhat tried to backfit a body of knowledge onto this sort of pseudoscience. They tried to create some standards, and certainly I was one of them: the Australian New Zealand standard, the ISO standard, COSO, the UK Institute of Risk Management standard, and so on, for very laudable reasons, which is to obtain some consistency. The honest truth, however, is that consistency was often lost within the consensus process, which invariably means fudging things so that we can encompass a wide range of views without actually agreeing what something means or why we have to stick to a particular process. And the third influence, and we've seen that certainly in the last 10 years or so, is that regulators and legislators jumped onto the bandwagon and said, well, we must force people in certain sectors or more generally to do risk management. In Australia, for example, the Australian Securities Exchange, the ASX, has published what we know as the third edition of the Corporate Governance Guidelines that makes some specific requirements in terms of risk management. In the financial services sector, not only do you have to do risk management, but you have to do it in a certain way, and you have to generate certain documents that have specific titles on them, like the risk appetite statement, the risk management plan. You have to have a risk register, but nobody really knows what those things are there for, or indeed what their purpose is. But then that doesn't matter, because we can backfit that sort of thinking after we've come up with the title. And so you see, we've ended up with this pernicious triangle. We started out with these consultants and in-house specialists who became the disciples, and they grouped together to codify this, and then that codification led to the imposition of compliance obligations from regulators, insurance companies, and so on. And guess what? Organizations then needed help to comply with the requirements, and they therefore turned to consultants and in-house specialists, who of course benefited greatly from this, and then went through to codify in even greater detail and use even more exotic language which nobody else could understand, which then in turn has become imposed as compliance obligations and so on. And so you see why we've called this pernicious. This is not only difficult, but it's painful and unpleasant. One of the things that characterizes present-day risk management are these things called edifices. You know, whether you call them systems or frameworks, there's an external organization for risk management outside the organization itself. This belief system called risk management doesn't just require a different way of thinking, but it actually requires a different organizational structure, its own language. And although there's often an instruction in the code that says you must customize this to suit your organization, the truth is it is one size fits all. There is just one methodology. Your documents have to have that title, have to have these things in them. You have to fit in with this one model, even though, of course, every organization is different and of course, has its own purpose and its own way of making decisions, its own rationale. And because these edifices are actually fundamentally flawed, I mean, even the good old 5x5 matrix really is hopeless. And there have been so many proper attempts to show that it's flawed, nevertheless it persists. Because, you know, at least it's a simple way, they say. It's a simple way of explaining these things, even if it's wrong. And I can tell you, having looked at these for many years now, the use of a matrix that is correct and is properly developed, there are few and far between. In fact, in most cases, invariably are the wrong. I think maybe 98% of the organizations that I've looked at over the last 30 years, the matrix is improperly. And the honest truth is, if you look around the world at all organizations, not just the few that answer the surveys put out by the audit companies, the truth is that very few organizations do any form of risk management. And of those that do, I mean, it's rather shocking that after all these years, so few score so well, so few actually score well in those surveys. Every few months, a new survey will come out that shows, 30% or 40% performance. And you start to think, well, if this is so good, why aren't people doing it better? If we've been doing this, we're writing standards now for nearly 30 years, why haven't they been adopted? If it's so obvious, why will organizations not do it as a natural part of the decision making? I suppose the most fanciful thought is this question of integration and embedding. And all the codes out there aspire to this as a vital principle, that risk management has to be integrated into the way the organization makes decisions. Well, it's totally fanciful. How can you integrate something which has a foreign language, is based in different concepts to the ones you're familiar with, that requires you to change your whole approach to decision making, turn it upside down to fit in with this unnatural risk management edifice? How can that be integration? How can that be embedding? That belief that this mythological characteristic of integration can be agreed, successfully implemented based on these codes that have been developed, it's wholly fanciful. In fact, it's utterly ridiculous. This is why Roger and I feel that risk management, quite frankly, has become a millstone around organizations' necks. Now, I know if you're watching this and you're in the risk management profession, this is really bad news for you, because I'm really saying that what you're doing is not creating a great deal of value for your organizations, despite what your belief system may tell you, despite what you might be convincing the people in your organization. The truth is that it conflicts with the normal way of doing things. It's wearying, it's costly. We need special teams, we need silos in organizations, we need special IT systems. We have to keep sending people on training courses because they can't seem to pick it up. And quite frankly, it's just frustrating. Nobody does it because they say, my God, this is the way to do it. You know, they say, oh God, I'm being forced to do it this way. I'm being forced to have a risk register. I'm being forced to create this document because I'm told to do it. And, you know, if you think about decision making, the essence of decision making is holding good conversations. Well, how can you have a good conversation? How can you have open and thorough communication where you're using a complex jargon, where we don't even use words which have normal meanings? We have special meanings, or we want to impose the word risk on something which does have a normal meaning. You know, we say it's not just the culture, it's the risk culture. It's not just governance, it's got to be risk governance. And then we come up with all these other exoticas, risk clock speed, risk appetite. I mean, to me, appetite means I want more food. But risk appetite means actually we want less risk. How do we convey that type of notion to people when they think the opposite? So, look, frankly, most of the edifices that we created in the years are just fatally flawed. And therefore, we have to conclude at this moment that risk management as it exists now does not create and protect value. Now, I know that's probably what you've been saying for years, but the truth is it actually degrades truly your organizational performance. If you look out there, as I've done, at all the studies that supposedly are supposed to show that risk management creates value, you will find that there's very few of them, and the ones that do exist always confuse correlation with causation. And invariably, you can start to see that organizations that are very successful, in other words, they've got some money around to spend, seem to be doing what we might say is good risk management. Could be just a coincidence, more likely a correlation rather than good risk management led to improvements in organizational performance. There is absolutely no evidence out there that directly links the following of one of these codes of practice, the building of these edifices, to improvements in organizational performance, especially when it's driven by a regulatory regime. And so the real problem here, and the real pernicious problem with risk management, is that if anything, it sucks resources out of other parts of the organization which could be working with decision makers to help them make better decisions, sounder decisions. It creates a false sense of security, a false sense of confidence, and diverts attention and resources from actually what people should be doing, which is improving the quality of their decision making. And therefore, however uncomfortable this may be to you, we've therefore concluded that risk management is probably hindering rather than helping deciders, those people who have to make decisions. It's actually preventing them making sound decisions rather than helping them make sound decisions. I mean, just be honest with yourself. When was the last time that anybody used a risk register to make a proper decision in your organization? I mean, I don't know. I've created hundreds, maybe thousands of these, and I wouldn't know how to do that. I wouldn't know how to take a risk register and actually use it to make a decision. And in some organizations, You know, these risk registers, well, I saw one once with 60 separate columns. It took all the risk managers time to fill out the risk register, let alone explain to decision makers what it all meant. Of course, you know, they have a piece of paper, they staple at the back of the pack, but they don't really consider it when they make a decision. So really, in conclusion, to some extent, we're talking about some fundamental weaknesses. Risk management is a concocted expression. Nobody out there knows what it means. There's no agreement on definitions. It doesn't seem to be aligned to an organization's individual character or context or even its purpose. It's an externality. And it's an externality which we're then told we have to integrate. And in fact, it's like adding oil to water. There's nothing behind it. You know, there is no science behind risk management. It's not been academically validated. And to be truthful, it's not even used consistently throughout the world. Every organization, every practitioner uses it somewhat differently for various reasons. So we can't even say that it's not like chemistry or engineering. There's no solid knowledge base behind it. The root of the problem is the fact that the words have been made up. It's reliant on a jargon which is totally arbitrary. A friend of mine has searched all the ISO standards out there and have found that there are 40 odd meanings of risk in ISO standards. Now, you know, ISO, International Standards Organization, is responsible for standardization, and even they can't agree what risk means. So how can we agree what risk management means if there's no definition of risk? And you will know that every time people use risk, they use it in a different context and different way. Is it to risk something? Do they use it as a verb? Do they use it as a noun? Excuse me. Do they mean the chance of something happening, or do they mean the consequences when it has occurred? Is it an organizational property? Do they confuse risks with risk? I mean, it's a complete mess. And so far, all we've done is added to that complexity over the years so that normal people out there who are faced with decision find it so complex. Even though many of us have tried over the years to use the word opportunity in its true sense, which is just an opportunity. It's a time or place when we can take advantage. Invariably, that has been misused to being some sort of upside alternative to risk. And the truth is that risk, generally, if you talk to people on the street, is about things going wrong. It's about avoiding, risk management is about avoiding failures rather than achieving successes. And, you know, organizations want to thrive. They want to advance. They want to create their purpose. They then want to achieve greater success, not just to focus on avoiding failures. So we've concluded that the time is up. It's time to drop risk management. And I don't mean just swap other words in for that. I mean, the whole edifice has become unsustainable. It's not succeeding. We've had a damn good shot at it over the years, but it's inevitable it wouldn't succeed because it's fatally flawed. And, you know, you could try and fix it, but it's a will-o'-the-wisp term like risk. And you can't fix anything that isn't real. You can't unscramble the egg. You know, the definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. So just tinkering with risk management is not going to fix it. The unfortunate thing is you just can't backfit knowledge onto a series of labels. You can't dream up pseudoscience. You can't create a belief system and then expect it to work. And it really isn't credible. In Australia, we say it doesn't pass the pub test, which means you go down the pub and you talk to the people there and they don't believe you. And try it. Say, I work in risk management, down the pub and get them to say what you actually do. And nobody there will understand what you do. And to be frank, you probably can't explain it to them. And yet it continues to absorb valuable resources each year. The cost goes up and up. But as I've mentioned before, the real issue is it detracts from the real challenge, which is decision makers making sounder decisions. And we've come to the conclusion that, you know, this millstone's just going to get heavier, and the only way forward is really to throw it out and start again. When we've suggested this, of course, to people, particularly in those organisations which are subject to high levels of regulation, the answer always comes back, of course, well, the regulators insist on us doing this. The regulators won't let us abandon this. And look, I don't believe it. I think you should challenge regulators. I think you should say, well, if you're a regulator and you require us to do this, explain why. Provide justification for your prescription. Tell me why I have to produce a risk appetite statement. Demonstrate, first of all, how I can actually produce it. Use words that don't include the word risk. And secondly, try and demonstrate how it can be used on a day-by-day basis. And I think you'll find that can't be done. So how do we move ahead? Well, don't tinker with it, just stop. Have a look at all these edifices that have been created and then dismantle them very quickly. One tip, of course, is don't give it to the risk management professionals to do this because, you know, people have old habits that die hard. You know, risk management is a bit like a cancer. If you leave a few cells in there, it'll spread out again. So it's got to be cut out completely. Shift the whole focus back to how your organisation makes sounder decisions and use plain language and terms which normal humans use on a day-by-day basis. And you don't need any new edifices for that. Decision-making is just part of life. It's part of what humans do. It's mainstream. You don't need a separate silo called the decision-making department. You just get on with it. And where there are risk management compliance obligations, challenge the regulators. Well, what's the proof that this thing actually works? This is just an unnecessary overhead. Please demonstrate why what I'm doing, which is improving my decision-making, isn't what you want. Why do I have to use this arcane belief system rather than just ensuring that my decisions are sounder in the future? So at the end of the day, we're back where certainly I was 44 years ago in my career, where people used to come to me and say, can you just give me a little bit of information to help me improve the quality of my decision, to give me more confidence that the decisions I'm making will lead to the outcomes I desire and won't lead to undesirable outcomes. And certainly Roger and I believe that decision-making is a relatively simple notion. There's an underlying methodology which is adopted by all humans to some degree and to some extent. Certainly within an organisation, decisions have to be consistent with the organisation's purpose so that when an opportunity presents itself, we make a decision based on achieving and furthering our organisation's purpose. And part of that is to ensure that we have sufficient certainty that we will get the outcomes we intend, particularly by dwelling on the assumptions that underlie our decision. And vitally importantly, that the decision provides certainty over the life of the decision and is not just short term. That does mean when we make decisions, of course, we have to consider the potential for change. We may have to build some monitoring into our decision to make sure that if the basis of our assumptions changes, the context moves, we have to then revisit that decision and maybe change it. And decision-making is achieved through simple things like thinking, gathering information, looking around, and particularly by having good, informed discussion. It's not by creating these huge edifices, invariably with a 3-letter acronym like ERM. So it's very simple. And indeed, Roger and I have taken some time over the last few months to write a fairly short book explaining how organisations can improve the quality of their decision-making so that they have sufficient certainty that the outcomes will be those they desire and that those outcomes will perpetuate over the life of the decision. Thank you very much.